What if the problems that have been exhausting you, the ones that arrive without warning, the ones that appear in the middle of an ordinary moment and suddenly make everything feel heavy and complicated and slightly threatening, what if most of those problems were never real? Not in the sense that your suffering isn't real. The suffering is completely real. But in the sense that the situation that produced the suffering didn't actually contain what your brain told you it contained. The problem was generated, constructed, built from incomplete information and filled in with something your brain chose, automatically and instantly, without asking your permission or your input. And what if there is a specific, well-documented reason your brain does this every single day? A reason that makes complete sense once you understand it. A reason that traces back to something so fundamental about how the brain works that knowing it doesn't just explain the problem, it immediately begins to change it. Because you cannot unsee a mechanism once you've seen it clearly. And a mechanism you can see is a mechanism you can interrupt. Here's what's actually happening. Your brain does not experience reality directly. That is the most important sentence in everything I'm going to say today, so I want you to stay with it for a moment. Your brain does not experience reality directly. It experiences a model of reality, a constructed, interpreted, gap-filled model that is assembled from incoming sensory data and then heavily edited, supplemented, predicted, completed, by everything your brain already believes about how the world works, how people behave, what situations mean, and what is likely to be dangerous. This editing process is not a flaw. It is the core operating system of a brain that needs to respond to the world faster than it can fully analyze the world. Because analyzing everything completely and accurately before responding would be too slow. So the brain takes incoming data, partial, ambiguous, often genuinely unclear, and runs it through its pattern recognition system, matches it to the closest existing template, fills in the missing pieces with the most statistically probable completion, and presents you with a finished experience. A complete picture. A situation with a clear meaning. A problem with a clear shape. And all of that happens before your conscious mind sees any of it. By the time you are aware of the situation, the interpretation is already done. The meaning is already assigned. The emotional response is already beginning to activate. You didn't choose any of it. You weren't consulted. Your brain made a judgment call in milliseconds and presented you with the result as if it were simply what is happening. Most of the time that process is accurate enough. Most of the time the pattern match is close enough to reality that the model works. But when the brain is running in a state of heightened vigilance, when the underlying calibration is set toward threat, toward caution, toward the anticipation of difficulty, the pattern matching becomes systematically biased. It fills in the gaps with the threatening version. It chooses the interpretation that requires the most preparation. It constructs the problem because constructing a problem that turns out not to exist is safer, from the brain's perspective, than missing a problem that does. And you get the problem. Every day. Sometimes many times a day. Generated not from what is actually happening but from what your brain decided was most likely happening based on incomplete information and a bias toward threat that has been running so long you forgot it was a bias and started treating it as perception. Here is what this looks like from the inside, specifically, because I want you to recognize it not as a concept but as something that happened to you recently. Someone sends you a message that is shorter than usual. One sentence where normally there would be 3. No explanation. Your brain processes the gap, the missing warmth, the absent context, and fills it. It doesn't present you with a range of equally probable explanations. It presents you with one. They are upset with you. Something you did. Something you said. You don't know what, but the evidence is there in the brevity, in the absence of the usual tone, in the way the message ended without the thing it usually includes. And now you are in a problem. A real, felt, physically activated problem. Your stomach is slightly tight. Your mind is beginning to review recent interactions for the source of the damage. You are composing responses and rejecting them. You are already in the middle of a situation that has weight and urgency and emotional content. And then they respond again, normally, warmly, and it becomes clear they were just busy. There was no problem. There was never a problem. There was a short message and a gap, and your brain's pattern recognition system filled the gap with the most threat-relevant completion available to it. And you suffered through a problem that your own mind invented, completely, from nothing more than an absence of information. That happens to you every day. Not always about messages. About tone of voice. About facial expressions. About silence in a conversation. About the way someone looked at you or didn't look at you. About the outcome of something that is still uncertain. About a sensation in your body that could mean anything, and your brain chose the concerning interpretation. About a memory that surfaced for no clear reason, and your brain attached significance to the surfacing. Every day, assembled from gaps, filled with the threatening version, delivered to you as reality. Here is the intervention. Right here, because the understanding alone isn't enough. The intervention is a pause and a question. Not an elaborate one. A single, honest, specific question asked at the moment you notice you are inside a problem that arrived suddenly and feels urgent and slightly larger than what the actual facts in front of you can fully justify. The question is, what do I actually know versus what did my brain add? 2 columns. Not written, not formal. Just honest. What is the actual, factual, observable data in front of me right now? And what is the interpretation, the completion, the meaning my brain assigned to that data without my conscious participation? The short message is data. They are upset with you is an addition. The silence after you spoke is data. They are judging you is an addition. The uncertain outcome is data. It is probably going to go badly is an addition. The physical sensation is data. Something is wrong with me is an addition. The addition is not always wrong. Sometimes the interpretation is accurate. Sometimes the problem is real. But the question forces you to see the seam between the data and the story your brain built on it. And the moment you can see that seam, the moment the construction becomes visible, the emotional response begins to loosen. Not because the situation is now fine. Because you are no longer treating a story as a fact. You are treating it as a hypothesis. And a hypothesis can be tested, questioned, held lightly, revised when more information arrives. A fact cannot. That shift, from fact to hypothesis, is not a small thing. It is the difference between being inside the problem your brain invented and being the person looking at the problem your brain invented and deciding whether it deserves the emotional resources you're about to spend on it. There's a deeper reason the brain fills the gaps with threat specifically, and understanding it removes the last layer of why am I like this that makes this whole experience feel like a character flaw. The brain's gap-filling system is calibrated by experience, by what has happened before in situations that looked like this one. And if you have had experiences, and most people have, in one form or another, where the gaps genuinely did contain something threatening, where the short message really was coldness, where the silence really was judgment, where the uncertain outcome really did go badly, where the problem you sensed was actually there even before it became visible, then your brain learned something from those experiences. It learned that the gaps are not safe. That absence of information is not neutral. That the most efficient and protective strategy is to assume the worst-case completion because the worst-case completion, when it turns out to be wrong, costs you only some unnecessary distress. But the optimistic completion, when it turns out to be wrong, costs you being caught off guard. And being caught off guard in a situation that had pain in it is something your brain is designed to avoid at almost any cost. So the invented problems are not random. They are not your brain malfunctioning. They are your brain applying a lesson it learned in a genuine context to every subsequent situation that resembles that context even slightly. The lesson was correct when it was formed. The application has become too broad, too automatic, too fast, generating problems in situations that don't actually carry the original threat because the pattern recognition system cannot distinguish between the context where the lesson was true and the context where it is being reflexively applied. You are not seeing things that aren't there because something is wrong with you. You are seeing things that aren't there because something in your past taught your brain to look for them. And brains are very obedient to what they've been taught. The second intervention goes directly at the calibration problem, rather than just the individual instances of it. Because the pause and the question helps in the moment. But the reason you keep needing it is that the underlying setting, the threat-biased gap-filling, keeps regenerating the same pattern in new situations. And the setting changes not through insight but through accumulated evidence. Through your brain building a new track record of gaps that turned out to be nothing. Ambiguities that resolved neutrally. Silences that were just silences. Short messages that were just brevity. Uncertain outcomes that were survivable. Sensations that didn't mean anything catastrophic. That evidence builds when you stop confirming the invented problem with the behavior that the invented problem would require. When you don't send the anxious follow-up message seeking reassurance. When you don't withdraw from the person you assumed was judging you. When you don't begin the elaborate internal preparation for the bad outcome before you know there is one. Because every time you act on the invented problem as if it were real, you confirm it to your brain. You give the pattern recognition system evidence that the threatening interpretation was correct, because you responded to it the way you respond to real threats. And the calibration stays biased. When you sit with the hypothesis instead of acting on the fear, when you wait for the actual information instead of filling the gap yourself with confirming behavior, you give your brain a different kind of evidence. Nothing happened. The gap was just a gap. The ambiguity resolved into something ordinary. And the threat that was anticipated didn't materialize. That evidence, accumulated over time, is what actually begins to shift the calibration. Not one instance. Many instances. Patiently. Consistently. The new data entering the pattern recognition system and slowly updating what it treats as the most probable completion for a gap. There's something about the exhaustion of this that I want to name directly before we close, because I think it explains something about how you've been feeling that might not have had a clear cause until now. Inventing problems is tiring in a very specific way. It's not the tiredness of doing difficult things. It's the tiredness of experiencing difficult things that didn't need to happen. Of spending emotional resources on situations that your own mind generated. Of going through the physiological activation, the cortisol, the muscle tension, the narrowed attention, the rumination, of a real problem, multiple times a day, for problems that evaporate the moment more information arrives. That is a specific kind of depletion. Not proportional to anything in your actual external life. Not explainable by the actual demands of your actual day. Just the quiet, constant, invisible drain of a brain that has been constructing emergencies in the gaps between ordinary moments and a nervous system that has been responding to each of them with the full cost of a genuine stress response. And the confusion that comes with it, the slight disorientation of feeling genuinely depleted without being able to point to a clear cause, that confusion adds its own weight. Because when you can't explain why you're tired, you start to wonder if something is wrong with you. If you're weak. If you're handling your life inadequately. If other people move through the same days without this invisible cost. They don't. Or at least, many of them carry a version of the same thing at a lower volume. But regardless, the confusion clears when the mechanism is visible. When you understand where the depletion is coming from, you stop turning the confusion into another invented problem. You stop adding the "what is wrong with me" to the already running list. You see the source. And seeing the source is what makes it possible to address the source rather than just manage the symptoms of it while the source keeps generating them. Your mind invents problems every day. Not because it is broken. Because it is fast, efficient, threat-sensitive, and working from a template that was built in circumstances that are no longer entirely your circumstances. Because it would rather construct a problem that turns out to be nothing than miss a problem that turns out to be something. Because it learned, somewhere, that the gaps are not safe, and it has been filling them faithfully and exhaustingly ever since. The pause and the question, what do I actually know versus what did my brain add, is the interrupt. The gap between data and story is where your agency lives. Where you can stand and see clearly before the emotional response has fully committed to a situation that may not exist. where you can hold the hypothesis lightly rather than treating it as fact. The evidence you accumulate every time you wait for the real information instead of acting on the invented problem is what changes the calibration over time. Slowly, without drama, by showing your brain, in the only language it actually trusts, that the gaps have been consistently, reliably less threatening than it predicted. It will still generate problems. That doesn't stop immediately, and it doesn't stop completely. But the problems get quieter. The gap between the initial construction and the moment you recognize it as a construction gets shorter. And the suffering that used to run the full length of an invented emergency starts to cut off earlier, sometimes before it's even fully formed, because you've gotten fast enough at seeing the seam between what is real and what your brain added that the addition no longer has time to feel like fact. That's what changes. Not the brain. Your relationship to what the brain produces. And that relationship is entirely yours to decide. Every day. In the gap. In the pause. In the honest question. That's where the inventing stops having the same power it always has.